"Help me," the girl said. The desert sun was merciless. An old, dust-covered SUV was swerving wildly down the middle of a deserted road, where the scorching heat sent shimmering hazes rising over the asphalt. Victor's heavy breathing behind the wheel echoed louder in the car than the wind battering against the windows. One of his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles whitened, and the other strongly pressed against his blood-soaked abdomen. The hot blood gushing through his fingers had long since soaked the passenger seat and floor mats dark red. The trail. He had narrowly escaped the trap of those he trusted, but the cost was brutal. At the end of the rattling dirt road, beyond the fierce sandstorm obstructing his view, an isolated old cabin appeared. It was an abandoned house with half its door ripped off and broken windows clumsily boarded up. But to Victor, it was the only safe fortress in the world. Upon opening the door, a musty smell of mold and dry dust hit him. Victor groaned and headed to the corner of the living room. As he pushed hard with his shoulder against the side of an old wardrobe leaning against the wall, a creepy scraping sound rang out, revealing a square hatch to the basement hidden underneath. That single heavy wardrobe was the sole camouflage hiding this safe house's only secret. Victor lifted the hatch and went down the narrow ladder into the basement. The basement was narrow and chilly. Victor found a first aid kit in the corner, hastily stopped the bleeding with trembling hands, wrapped a compression bandage, and finished his first aid by stabbing a morphine ampule into his inner thigh. As the cold drug spread through his veins, he gritted his teeth and caught his breath for a moment. Once the burning pain dulled, he took out a satellite phone and dialed. After a few rings, the voice of his colleague, Gary, came through. "You're still alive, thank God." Hearing the voice over the receiver, Victor felt a fleeting, bizarre wrongness amidst his short-lived relief. But having lost too much blood, he lacked the energy to delve deep into that feeling. Spitting out short curses, he briefly explained the situation of falling into the traitor's trap and hurriedly requested a pickup. Gary replied he understood, said he would get there as fast as possible, and told him to wait right there without moving. Hanging up the phone, Victor dug through a pile of boxes in the corner and found a dusty bottle of cheap whiskey. He tore off the cap with his teeth and drank straight from the bottle. As the burning alcohol rushed down his esophagus, even the heavy edge of pain that the morphine couldn't suppress seemed to dull. A sigh, mixed with deep depression and anger, faded into the heavy air of the basement. 1 glass. 2 glasses. As he leaned back in the chair, taking shallow breaths and sinking into the darkness, it happened. Rustle. In the corner of the basement, a disorganized warehouse-like space that should have been dead silent, a faint presence was heard. Victor's dim eyes changed instantly, and his body instinctively sprang forward, a movement unbelievable for someone severely injured and bleeding. Thinking he might have misheard, Victor concentrated and found a small figure huddled deep in the narrow shadow between the piles of boxes, with her arms wrapped around her head. "I'm sorry. Please spare me. Please." From the mouth of the subdued girl, only those 3 phrases repeated themselves, buried deep in her arms. Loosening his tense grip slightly, Victor asked in a low voice, "Who are you, and when did you get in here?" Terrified and unable to answer properly, the girl merely repeated her pitiful pleas for her life, with her face buried deep in her arms. Victor, easing the force of his rough grip that was pinning her down, finally began to examine the girl carefully. Her brown hair was a mess, covered in dirt and dust, hiding her face so he couldn't see it properly. However, the faint sobbing leaking from between her arms and her slightly trembling shoulders suggested she was young. She wore a white crop top under a thin cardigan and a short, checkered, pleated miniskirt that came up well above her knees. Without realizing it, the girl kept pulling down the somewhat awkwardly short hem of that skirt with one hand. Between the outfit she likely chose to look pretty and her clumsy gestures trying to cover it up out of embarrassment, Victor saw the traces of a child who had failed at imitating an adult. Down to her dirt-covered sneakers, She was dressed just like an ordinary teenage girl. However, she was an entirely alien presence that did not fit in this abandoned basement in the middle of the desert. Scanning the girl, Victor asked dryly, still not letting his guard down, "Are you hungry?" Victor didn't wait for her answer, but picked up a dusty can rolling around in the corner of a shelf. Taking out his dagger and roughly popping the lid off, he pushed the opened can toward the girl with a sharp, metallic sound. The girl slowly lowered one arm to look at the can placed before her, but still covered half her face with her other hand. Though she could have scrambled for it hungrily, she just blankly shook her head and answered in a barely audible voice, "I'm sorry. I really don't know why I'm here or where this is." Victor's brow furrowed. This hideout was strictly managed by the organization, and while he considered someone might have temporarily locked her up before leaving for an errand, the fact that he was the only one nearby confused him further. Hadn't Gary, who was closest, just told him it would take quite some time to pick him up? Seeing the tense girl looking only at the ground, unable to meet his eyes, he judged she wouldn't be an immediate threat. Victor turned around, sat in his chair, and took a sip of whiskey. "If you can't remember, it can't be helped. I don't know this place either. But someone from my company is coming soon, and I'm waiting for him." "Someone from your company? What company? Can he take me home?" "I don't know either. What's your name?" The girl buried her face deeper into her arms, trying to recall something, but ultimately failed. Looking at the girl whose name and home had been erased, Victor felt something twisting terribly. Past memories flashed through his mind, where such ominous premonitions had always ended badly. The girl, staring anxiously at her toes, and Victor, looking indifferent but drinking his whiskey without lowering his guard around her. Heavy silence flowed between the two when the quiet satellite phone rang. It was Gary. "It's me. I'm almost there. But arriving nearby, something feels off. Go outside, look around, and check if anything is strange." Making a gunshot victim scout the area. However, the ominous premonition he had just felt made the check necessary. Victor hung up and turned to the girl with a low growl. "Stay still. Don't make a sound." Victor dragged his heavy feet up the ladder and out into the first-floor living room, then pushed the wardrobe back by putting all his weight on his shoulder while pressing his side with one hand. Screech! With a terrible scraping sound, the wardrobe completely covered the hatch again. To anyone else, it would just look like an old piece of furniture shoved into the corner of the wall. It had to be. To leave an unidentified girl under his feet, he had to secure things at least that much. He swallowed his pain and went up to the second floor, where a narrow hallway stretched ahead with two closed doors on either side and a heavily dust-covered full-length mirror at the end, seemingly used as a bedroom area by former residents. Victor entered the nearest room, pushed his binoculars through the cracks of a broken window, and surveyed outside. The desert was dead silent, with only sandstorms swirling. Abandoned tires, rotting wooden fences. There were no special ambushes or signs of enemies. He could have waited for Gary there, but Victor, concerned about the girl in the basement, swallowed his pain and went down the stairs. The moment he stepped into the first-floor living room, Victor's steps froze. The wardrobe, which he had pushed with both hands to perfectly cover the hatch, had been pushed aside enough for one person to easily slip through. Beyond the wardrobe, the dark, square outline of the closed hatch was visible. It looked as if someone had moved the wardrobe and then neatly closed the hatch back. Victor held his breath and aimed his gun forward, his adrenaline surging as he cautiously stepped around the wardrobe and lifted the hatch. He descended the ladder in taut tension, ready to pull the trigger at any moment, but the basement was empty. In the middle of the empty basement, Victor gripped his dagger's handle so hard it felt like it would shatter, as the girl's traces were nowhere to be found. Only the half-empty whiskey bottle next to the chair and the untouched can he had roughly tossed to her indifferently proved that someone had been here just moments ago. Fuck. A low curse died away under the yellow fluorescent light. The cold sweat running down his forehead and neck seeped into his side's compression bandage, creating a deeper, more cloying pain. Lifting his shirt to check, dark red blood was seeping through the bandages again, staining the inside of his shirt so deeply you'd believe it was originally that color. The bleeding hadn't stopped. He had run across the desert with a gunshot wound and lost too much blood, and poured morphine and half a bottle of whiskey on top of that. An impulse to dismiss everything as a drug-induced hallucination briefly took hold of him. However, the moment he recalled the weight of the wardrobe pushed aside for one person, that impulse gave way to the cold possibility that someone else might be breathing in this house besides him. He clearly remembered moving it and going up to the second floor. Gary's words about feeling weird echoed in his mind. Victor leaned his heavy body back against the chair and pulled the whiskey bottle closer. One sip. In his blurry vision, the bitter residual heat of the alcohol slowly spread to his brain. And then it happened. "Help me." Victor's hand stopped abruptly. A thin girl's voice, definitely drifting from somewhere in this basement, or beyond it. But inside the narrow basement, there was no form other than Victor himself. He slowly readjusted his grip on the dagger's handle. He wanted to run toward the source of the voice immediately, but his consciousness, patched together with morphine, whiskey, and blood loss, didn't let him move so simply. He had to stay vigilant. A shred of his instinct was screaming that it was a young girl's voice, a safe house in the middle of the desert, and the wardrobe was moved aside. Everything was too easy. Perhaps this was the second stage of the trap, a more elaborate trap designed so that he, who survived the dawn ambush, would ultimately trip over a shred of sympathy and collapse. He slowly climbed the ladder back to the living room, one hand on his dagger, the other pressing his side. Somewhere overhead, in the darkness of the second floor, the faint voice seemed to call him once more. Or perhaps not. When he stepped on the first stair, the old wood let out a short screech, and when he stepped on the last step of the second floor, a girl, who had been looking down toward the first floor from the middle of the hallway, was startled and turned to face him. "Don't move." The girl raised both hands and took a step back, her blue eyes trembling. The face she had covered with her arms entered his vision for the first time. "Please don't shoot." "I specifically told you to stay put. How did you get up here?" The girl's lips hesitated before slowly parting. "You called me, mister." "What?" "From upstairs, asking for help. I heard your voice. That's why I came up." Victor's spine stiffened instantly as he slowly shook his head. "I never did that." "I definitely heard it. You asking for help while injured." "I said I didn't." Victor's voice sank deeper. "While coming up, did you run into anyone else? Did you see anyone?" The girl slowly shook her head, but her eyes weren't looking at Victor. She was staring at an empty space somewhere between the mirror behind him and the closed doors on either side. "No one. Just a voice." Victor's grip on the dagger tightened even more as his mind quickly scrambled. He had never called for her, so she was either lying or she heard his voice in her head rather than his own. Or, even more terrifyingly, all of this was happening only inside his own head from the beginning. Looking straight at Victor, the girl opened her mouth with a trembling voice. "Mister, this house is weird. I definitely heard someone calling from upstairs, but there was no one, and I keep hearing someone walking downstairs. But when I go down, no one is there. I want to get out of here right now. Please, let's leave together, okay?" Sincerity filled the girl's eyes. It was clear she was afraid of this house, of something in it. But Victor had no time to question what exactly it was. Sure of one thing, however, he relaxed his shoulders just a little. He was certain that if this safe house was really a second trap, at least this young girl wasn't an accomplice. Outside, the heavy sound of an engine, accompanied by the screech of old brakes, cut through the desert's silence. Victor sheathed his dagger and walked past the girl to the window. As he pushed his binoculars through the cracks in the boards of the broken window, and looked down at the yard. His broad back blocked the late afternoon light, only allowing a sliver of the yard's scenery to pass through the narrow space between his shoulders. Over Victor's back, the girl saw the face of a man slowly getting out of a black pickup truck stopped in the yard. An old leather jacket, a slightly tilted baseball cap, thick shoulders, and sluggish steps. That face. The girl's hand slowly covered her mouth. The cool air and terrible smell of alcohol from the car that night, which had been erased, began to choke her once again. It was an unusually cold Friday night, and the party at her friend's house was the worst. Her boyfriend got drunk and tried to cross the line, and the girl fought with him, pushing him away hard. Her boyfriend left her stranded on the street. On a deserted national highway with sparse streetlights, Chloe, wearing only a thin cardigan, was walking while shivering from cold and sorrow. Just then, headlights shone, and a black pickup truck slowly reduced its speed and stopped next to her. The passenger window rolled down, revealing a familiar face. It was Gary, the dad of her best friend since childhood, Sarah.
Chloe? What are you doing out here alone this late at night?
I missed my ride. That's dangerous. Hop in, I'll give you a ride. But there's a place I originally had to go, so I might need to make a quick stop. Is that okay? It was late at night, pitch dark all around, and with no other option, Chloe nodded and got into the passenger seat, where the warm heater air melted her frozen body. By the time the car left Route 17 and entered a quiet outskirt road, slightly tipsy, Gary glanced at Chloe and broke the silence. Was the party fun? Kids these days are really open-minded. Did you guys have some fun at the party too? Chloe frowned internally at the sleazy question, but because it was her friend's dad, she forced a faint smile and played along. Well, kids these days are a bit fast. We just listened to music and hung out. Right, you should enjoy it when you're young. I understand everything. Gary's gaze briefly dropped to Chloe's knee area and came back up, adding one more thing without erasing his sleazy smile. But our Chloe has grown up so much. Every time Sarah showed me pictures of you, you got prettier. And you dressed up today? That skirt. Who did you dress up to impress? Chloe felt her fingers resting on her knees stiffen slightly, but she lightly shrugged her shoulders and turned her gaze out the window. It's a hangout with friends. Just a bit more than usual. What kind of friends? Any boyfriends? You're at the age to be super popular. No way, not really. Sarah is way more popular. Chloe let out an awkward, short laugh and deflected the topic. Gary's words had a strangely oily quality to them, but Chloe, having just fought with her boyfriend and being exhausted, brushed it off. Eventually, the truck stopped in front of a dilapidated cabin in the desert, completely cut off from people. Gary turned off the engine and, in the dark and narrow car, slowly turned his body toward Chloe, a strong smell of whiskey hitting her. His thick, rough hand suddenly came up onto Chloe's thigh. Chloe pressed herself tight against the window and slapped his hand away. Mister, what are you doing right now? Are you crazy? I'm Sarah's friend. Gary, looking flustered but unable to let go of his lingering desire, made a sleazy excuse. Hey, come on, don't freak out. The way you were talking in the car, it came across a certain way, that's all. I just figured you'd be cool with it. You know how your generation is about these things. Chloe had just been harassed by her boyfriend for the same thing. As her anger and humiliation built up, something inside her snapped. Me? Really? Take a look in the mirror when you get out of the car. Where do you get the nerve to hit on someone with that belly and that hair? Do you know why Sarah's mom sleeps in a separate room lately? It's probably because watching you snore next to her makes her feel like her life has been a waste. You're truly pathetic and disgusting. Unprepared for such raw criticism, Gary's face turned bright red instantly, and his facial muscles spasmed. His shallow pride completely trampled, he tried hard to suppress his anger and backed off. I'm sorry. I think I misunderstood terribly. The situation seemed to be ending, but the mouth of Chloe, who had lost her reason in anger, didn't stop. "Does your wife know you go around doing disgusting things outside? What about Sarah?" Oh, poor Sarah. Now she's going to have to take the red pill, too. What? Like in The Matrix, waking up from fake peace to face the real truth of the world. A terrible world of truth where her own father is irredeemable trash who hits on her friend. Snap. At that moment, something broke inside Gary. "You fucking whore. Do you have any idea who I am?" As Chloe tried to open the car door, Gary snatched her hair like a beast, and in the narrow car, his rough hands strangled Chloe's thin neck and forcefully pinned her down into the seat. Slowly, Chloe stepped backward. The man who arrived in the yard was unmistakably Sarah's dad, Gary, the owner of those thick hands that crushed her neck that night. He had now arrived in the yard of this house, and the phrase, "company guy," that had come out of Victor's mouth was now horribly concrete in her mind. Victor was also part of Sarah's dad's group. They were of the same breed, or perhaps an even more dangerous breed. "I have to run." Victor was still holding the binoculars against the window frame, observing the pickup truck in the yard. She covered her mouth with one hand, spoke in the smallest voice possible, and slowly stepped backward. I'm going to the bathroom." Without waiting for an answer, she immediately turned her back. As she moved as quickly as possible, Victor's indifferent voice followed behind her. "Don't leave the second floor. Stay there." As Chloe closed the door of the small bathroom at the end of the hallway and latched it, her hands were already trembling faintly. Placing both hands on the edge of the cold sink, she slowly raised her head. In the yellowed bathroom mirror, the face she saw for the first time since the incident was staring back at her. The girl in the mirror was not the girl she knew. Through her messy brown hair, a faint bruise stretched horizontally across her pale cheek. Her lips were cracked dark red, and the capillaries in the whites of her eyes had completely burst, staining them blood red. Those horrifying eyes, looking as if someone had poured ink into them, glared straight at her from beyond the mirror. Chloe's hands, against her own will, slowly moved toward her neck. On the skin touched by her fingertips, 5 thick finger marks were etched in a pale blue hue. The marks in the mirror and the depth of the contours felt by her fingertips matched exactly. At that moment, the memory of the inside of the car struck her head once more, her light body being crushed into the narrow seat, the smell of whiskey filling up to her nose, her crushed windpipe. Her hands began to shake, as if having a seizure. She tried to grab her trembling hand with her other hand to stop it, but both hands only bumped against each other, unable to remain still. Right then, the voices of 2 men faintly drifted up from the first-floor living room beyond the bathroom door. Victor and the man who tried to kill her. Chloe covered her mouth with both hands and took short breaths. Standing on her tiptoes, she opened the bathroom door just a crack with the smallest possible movement. Lowering her body completely, she approached the narrow gap between the staircase railings at the edge of the hallway, where she could see down to the first floor. From the living room, the 2 men's voices started to sound a bit clearer. "My God, Victor, look at the state of you." Gary's voice was deep and low, as if genuinely worried, but his hands were empty. Without a medical bag or first aid kit, he had simply entered the living room, straightening the collar of his leather jacket. Without a gesture offering a seat, Victor simply stared at Gary, one hand resting heavily on the pistol on his lap. A brief silence fell over the living room.
"Did you come alone?"
That was Victor's first word. Gary stared at Victor for a long time, a short, baffled laugh hanging at the end of his gaze. "Fuck, Victor. Do you even have a guess who hit you at dawn? It leaked from the inside. Who can you trust to ride next to you? Who can you trust besides you and me?" Victor gave a short nod, within which was both, "Yeah, true," and, "Is it really just you?" simultaneously, but neither showed on his face. Gary glanced at the pistol on Victor's lap, sighed faintly, pulled up a chair, and sat facing him.
How did you get out?
The three who went with me, Victor's voice sank a beat. All dead. They were guys I've never seen before. Looked like mercenaries, but I don't have a clue. Looking genuinely shocked, Gary lost his words for a moment, wiping his face with one hand and spitting out a low curse. All three? Damned bastards. I won't let them off if they're caught. Let's hear the details when we leave. First, we have to go to Dr. Mama. If you bleed for another hour like this, there's no hope. No first aid here? This is no place to play MacGyver. I have blood packs and painkillers in the car. Dr. Mama is all set to receive you. Can you stand? Gary stood up and reached out his hand. But instead of taking it, Victor raised her hand briefly to stop him. Wait. Why? There's a brown-haired girl upstairs. Let's take her with us. A short silence fell over the living room again, and Gary's hand froze for a beat. What? I don't even know her name. Just a young, brown-haired girl. She was in this safe house. If we drop her off in any city on the way, she'll at least be able to get help from others. Gary slowly raised his head and stared at Victor, that short, baffled laugh hanging on his eyes again. Victor, you downed morphine and whiskey. You're going through a lot of drug side effects. Many people see hallucinations. There's no way a person is here. This is the middle of the desert. It's not a hallucination. Victor raised his head a beat and shouted briefly toward the ceiling. Kid, come down. It's clear. A heavy silence fell over the living room again. No footsteps or signs of movement returned, no matter how long they waited. See, Victor, I told you it's a hallucination. Victor's brow furrowed slowly. He also suspected it might be a hallucination, but it was too vivid to dismiss as one, so he didn't want to believe it was. Thinking that seeing the girl with Gary would confirm whether it was a hallucination or not, Victor tried to stand up from his chair, pressing one hand on the armrest. The moment his knee was about to buckle from a fresh burst of pain in his side, Gary's two hands supported him with a skillful touch. Without touching the compression bandage area on his side at all, he expertly supported Victor's weight entirely on his good shoulder and leg on the opposite side. One side of Victor's facial muscles stiffened minutely, but he quickly shoved that stiffness under a serene expression. Thanks. Sit down. You can't move. I think it's a hallucination, but it's better than leaving with doubts. It'll take 1 minute. I'll go take a look around. Okay? Victor gave a short nod, and Gary got up from his chair and slowly headed for the stairs. Victor leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. However, behind his closed eyelids, a certain gear in his head was slowly grinding out of sync. Did I ever say where I got hit? During the satellite phone call, he specifically said, 1 shot to the side. The dark red blood that had poured without pause had long since done more than soak over his shirt's original color. It had completely erased any map that might have shown where the wound was. To pick out the source of the bleeding at a glance from that horribly uniform crimson was impossible. Yet Gary's two hands, which had just supported him, hadn't faltered for even an instant on where to hold. And the first words of that phone call? You're still alive, thank God. That single line slowly rewound in Victor's head. He hadn't mentioned the ambush until after that call. He had requested a pickup, but he talked about almost dying after that conversation. How did Gary start with, "You're still alive," instead of a greeting? Victor's breathing deepened for a beat as the heavy footsteps disappearing into the darkness upstairs trampled the heavy wooden floorboards one by one. As Victor's closed eyes slowly opened, a low word leaked from his mouth. Gary. Gary stopped briefly in front of the bathroom door at one end of the narrow hallway. It was closed. He turned the knob slightly, but it wasn't latched, and as he opened the door a hand's breadth with a creak, there was no one inside the narrow bathroom. Just as he turned his head and was about to push open the slightly ajar door on the opposite side to check the room, A creak from the old floorboards made his head turn toward the sound. That brown hair, that short, checkered skirt. Chloe, standing awkwardly on tiptoes in her worn-out, dirty sneakers. Gary momentarily lost his balance, grabbing the door frame to steady his collapsing body.
How are you here?
I'm sorry. Please, spare me, please. Chloe's voice trembled. Before her brain could even catch up with why she was saying those words, the final second inside that car a few days ago crushed her whole body once again, and her mouth spewed out those exact same words. I'm sorry. Please, spare me. Please. Like a conditioned reflex, like trauma, once more and once more. Gary's hesitation wasn't long. He soon spat a short curse and lunged at her like a beast. This time I'll finish the job. The very thick fist that had crushed her neck in the car a few days ago flew in a full swing toward Chloe's face. Chloe unconsciously took a step back, and into that unconscious step, Gary's fist sailed past where her cheekbone should have been and smashed through the old wallpaper beyond. Crack, the dull sound of shattering drywall. Chloe stood frozen in place for a beat, and only then a gust of wind triggered by her stepping back slowly lifted her bangs. Only after that small breeze touched her skin did her two eyes slowly move toward the fist lodged a hand's breadth from her nose. In that brief moment, something cold trickled down the middle of her spine. It wasn't fear. It was a sensation deeper than fear, closest to what one would call intuition. All the questions about where she had been for the past few days, how she had drifted to a basement in the middle of this desert, and why those pale blue marks were etched on her neck, converged into a single, cold possibility in that one moment. Am I, perhaps? She couldn't even finish that sentence. As that possibility slowly took shape inside her, her breathing stopped for a beat, and the slight tremor disappeared from her shoulders. The fingers holding the hem of her short skirt, which she had been unconsciously pulling down, released it for the first time, and her blue eyes slowly faced Gary, who was frozen with his fist stuck in the wall. Her face hadn't changed. The faint bruise, the blood-red eyes, the messy brown hair, everything was the same. However, the direction of all of that had flipped. The face of a victim that had been crushed by something just moments ago had now become the face of someone who could crush something. Gary, slowly pulling his fist from the wall, clearly saw that change right in front of his face. What are you? A short tremor escaped his lips. It was the exact same pitch of tremor he had heard from Chloe a few days ago, one he had never let anyone hear in his life. Gary stumbled backward, 1 step, 2 steps. His will to swing his fist once more was slowly being crushed by that unidentifiable weight cast over the young child's face standing before him. With trembling hands, he quickly drew the Glock from his side holster. The moment the muzzle went up toward Chloe, she whipped her body around, kicked off the bedroom threshold, and escaped into the hallway with light footsteps. While Chloe ran down the narrow stairs in one breath, Gary paused at the bedroom threshold for a beat, holding his Glock with a trembling hand. Confronted with a new variable, his brain began to spin rapidly. Coming alone to Victor's rescue request was a gamble, but it had succeeded. Victor hadn't suspected him and didn't seem to have a clue. If they moved past this without him knowing, Gary had no reason to torment Victor further. However, the moment he began to calculate what Chloe might have told Victor, and what more she could say, the corners of his mouth slowly hardened in one direction. Chloe was a liability that could massively impact his family life, now that she was in Victor's hands. Victor had to die. Today. Right here. By his own hands. Gary readjusted his grip on the Glock and crossed the narrow hallway toward the stairs. Victor, who had his eyes closed in the living room, turned his head toward the stairs at the dull sound from the ceiling. Thud. A short sound like something hitting the wall. Victor tried to stand up while leaning on the chair's armrest, but his knee buckled from the pain in his side. He was momentarily trapped helplessly between his patched-up consciousness screaming at him to move and his body's answer that it couldn't. That was when it happened. Fast footsteps from the top of the stairs, but it wasn't Gary's heavy footsteps. It was the sound of someone light coming down at once on their tiptoes. The girl's face suddenly appeared in front of Victor's eyes in the dim light of the living room. "Mister!" Her voice was shaking with panic, and her face came clearly into Victor's sight. It was definitely the same face. The face he had offered the can to in the basement. The face that had looked at him in the second-floor hallway. But a thin layer of something else was overlaid on it. The outline of the faint bruise seemed a bit darker, and the whites of her blue eyes seemed minutely more bloodshot. It was clearly the same face, yet slightly different. Victor braced himself mentally, summing it up as, "Something happened upstairs." "Mister, that man is trying to kill you." Every word flowing out of Chloe's small mouth, however, wasn't just a scream pushed out by panic. In her head, all the clues she could gather to survive right now were aligning at a cold speed. Chloe was ready to tell the best lie to live. "I've been locked in this house for days. That man locked me up because I overheard his plan to kill you. In his car. In that man's car." Her breathing broke shortly. 1 beat, 2 beats. She was rapidly carving the edges of her lie into a shape that Victor would most easily accept. "Mister, you were attacked at dawn, right? By mercenaries? I heard that man talking to those people on the phone. At dawn. In the yard of this house." In Victor's head, the single gear that had been grinding out of sync for an hour slowly and perfectly clicked into place. The opening words, "You're still alive." The way his hands avoided that one wound without ever being told. And the girl, seeming to speak the truth in a trembling voice. The moment these 3 pieces formed a shadow, he realized that for an hour he had been delaying his decision, using the lack of a decisive piece as an excuse. Perhaps what he truly needed wasn't one piece of more elaborate evidence, but a single excuse that would allow him to kill his friend. Thus, Victor's knife tip was solidly sharpened upon a child's lie. Neither he, nor she, nor the person slowly descending the stairs overhead would ever know that the shadow of that lie coincidentally fell exactly in the middle of the truth. Understood. Victor slowly rose from his chair, sheathed his pistol back into his waist, and reversed his grip on the dagger. A stream of cold sweat ran down his back, but his eyes were no longer blurry. "You, go down to the basement and hide. There's a hatch in the corner of the living room. Go under it. No matter what you hear, never come up. Got it?" "Yes." "Hurry." Chloe tiptoed toward the corner of the living room. The wardrobe remained pushed aside from when Victor had frantically come up earlier, and the hatch just needed to be lifted with one hand. As she was sucked down the narrow ladder into the dark, gaping hole, the sound of heavy footsteps slowly approaching the stairs from upstairs began to echo. Victor hid his dagger behind his back and took a step back into the darkness of the living room next to the chair. The basement Chloe descended into was the same as when she was first discovered. The yellow light of the old fluorescent lamp, the half-empty whiskey bottle next to the chair, the untouched can on the concrete floor, the pile of boxes where she had huddled, covering her head. Everything was exactly as it was. Except for one thing. In the deepest corner of the basement, where the concrete floor ended and the packed dirt floor began, a patch of dirt with a different texture slowly drew her gaze. The surrounding dirt was solidly packed, but that one patch was somewhat loose. A space of about 3 square feet, slightly puffed up, looking as if someone had dug it up and covered it again. Chloe's feet stepped toward it against her will. She fell to her knees in front of that spot, as if in a trance. Her trembling fingertips slowly touched the surface of that dirt, that cold, light dirt that somehow shared a texture with her own skin. She began to dig it up with both hands. It wasn't deep, 1 hand's breadth, 2. Her fingertips touched something cold, not hard but fabric-like. Brushing off more dirt, the texture of the fabric became clearer. the texture of a thin cardigan soaked in dirt. And at the edge of that cardigan, her fingertips met another set of fingertips, cold and small, fingers shaped exactly like her own. Chloe's breathing stopped right there as her eyes slowly moved from those fingers to her own two hands, the small finger buried in the dirt and her own small finger that had dug it up. The fact that those two belonged to the exact same hand slowly pierced her mind, leaving nowhere else to run. The cold possibility that had crossed her intuition in the bedroom was now lying in the palm of her hand as a handful of dirt in this place. From her mouth, a scream that hadn't been unleashed once in the darkness of those past few days finally burst out all at once. The scream shot upwards, riding the narrow concrete walls of the basement. Victor's gaze, hiding in a narrow blind spot beyond the side table in one side of the living room, shook for a beat at the scream erupting from beneath his feet. Simultaneously, Gary's footsteps, stepping onto the final stair, froze for a beat at that scream. The two men's eyes met in the middle of the dim living room. Gary's hand holding the Glock instantly raised toward Victor, and Victor, hiding his dagger behind his back, lowered his shoulder for a beat. That scream was their starting signal. Gary's Glock spat fire first, but Victor had already thrown his body deeper into the table's shadow just before the first shot was fired. The first bullet missed and pierced the wallpaper, and the second shattered the back of the chair Victor had just been leaning against. From the edge of the table, Victor swiftly threw his dagger over his head. The blade drew a short arc and flashed in the dark. The knife tip buried shallowly into Gary's shoulder. It wasn't deep, but enough to make the hand holding his Glock shake for a beat. In that one beat, Victor popped out from behind the table. A fresh burst of pain in his side threatened to buckle his leg, but he gritted his teeth, fought through the pain, and briefly crossed the middle of the living room. Before his knees hit the floor, he swept Gary's legs with one hand, bringing him down together. Two massive beasts tangled on the narrow living room floor. Gary's Glock slid across the carpet and rolled out of sight. Victor's hand pulled out the dagger lodged in Gary's shoulder and drove it deep between his ribs, the lungs, upwards, accurately. A short, wet sound from deep inside his chest leaked out of Gary's mouth. Hook. Leaving the dagger there, Victor took a step back and drew his pistol. He had learned the hard way since his first year on the job that nothing is more dangerous than a dying beast's last struggle. Gary staggered and dropped to his knees. Both of his hands fumbled over his chest. His hand touching the dagger's handle, he slowly turned his head to look up at Victor. Fuck, Victor. Why, you? Why, Gary, after all these years? Dark red foam slowly hung on Gary's lips as he answered shortly, almost laughing. It's business, Victor. What feelings are there between you and me? I've never hated you. Just, there was no room. Victor didn't reply, but his hand holding the gun slowly lowered, along with another stream of cold sweat running down his side. Victor, Gary's voice rapidly faded. Don't take that girl, please. Victor didn't hear him. A deepened grogginess from the violent movement covered his consciousness again, and though he should have stayed there to finish his friend's last breath, his feet didn't bind him to that spot. Leaving that place, Victor headed to the kitchen, desperately thirsty. It's true. That girl, a few days ago, Gary's final breath slipped out with a short sob, and the moment his gaze emptied. Next to the wardrobe leading down to the basement, two small feet slowly stepped onto the living room carpet. Dirty sneakers. Her short, checkered skirt had patches of still wet dirt, and one side of her white crop top bore a dark stain, as if she had just gotten up from a dirt floor. Fingertips, wrists, knees, various parts of her body bore the traces of someone who had just scooped up a handful of dirt with their bare hands. Victor nervously rattled the dry kitchen faucet. Outside his vision, right next to Gary, collapsed in the middle of the living room, Chloe slowly dropped to her knees. Her face entered Gary's fading pupils, messy brown hair, a faint bruise, blood-red eyes, and the dirt from the basement, which he had packed with his own 2 hands a few days ago, smeared on her fingertips and knees.
Chloe.
Her hands, the light hands he had crushed a few days ago, slowly cupped his cheeks. There was no warm sensation anywhere. It was just cold, like dirt inside a grave. The corners of her mouth lifted faintly. It wasn't the smile of a 17-year-old girl. After killing me like this, did you really think Sarah would be okay? Gary's eyes widened with his final strength. No, Sarah. Sarah doesn't know anything.
I'm 17 too, just like Sarah.
Chloe's voice was soft, as if soothing a child to sleep. Gary's vision slowly sucked into her blood-red eyes. I didn't want to know this real world either. Sarah won't want to know either, nor that this isn't something we get to choose. Gary's last breath slipped out with a short. While his gaze emptied, Chloe slowly stood up from his face, and before Victor turned away from the kitchen, she disappeared back into the darkness of the living room without a sound. Victor returned to the living room and stared down at Gary's corpse for a long time. There was no satisfaction, only deep fatigue. He pulled the dagger from the corpse and wiped it on the shirt, grabbed Gary's Glock, satellite phone, and car keys, and quickly checked the living room for anything that could leave his traces. Finally, he called out shortly toward the hatch next to the wardrobe. Hey, come up. It's safe now. There was no answer. Girl, let's go together. Still no answer. Victor hesitated for a moment before pushing the wardrobe aside and lifting the hatch. While climbing down the ladder into the basement, a newly burst pain in his side shook him briefly. The basement was almost identical to when he first discovered it. The chair, whiskey bottle, untouched can, pile of boxes. But the girl was nowhere to be found. He quickly scanned the area all the way to the deepest part of the basement, but there were no signs of anyone digging up anything on the dirt floor. The texture of the packed dirt was perfectly uniform, and the concrete floor was clean. Did she run outside instead of the basement because she was scared? He briefly thought so, but soon slowly withdrew that thought, as this was the middle of the desert, a distance impossible to reach the nearest city without a car, a place a young child couldn't survive an hour alone. Fuck, I can't just leave her. The moment he climbed back up the ladder and emerged into the living room, a heavy grogginess settled thickly over his blood-loss, blurred vision once again. He leaned one hand on the wardrobe and caught his breath briefly. Dr. Mama. The one word closest to the truth among Gary's last words. He had to reach there within an hour to survive now. Is this the time to worry about others? Making that excuse to himself, he crossed the living room. Wandering in the desert is her destiny too. Chipping away the edges of his guilt like that, his hand grabbed the front doorknob. It was then. Help me. The thin voice of the girl, coming from nowhere, brushed past his back once. Victor's hand stopped dead. He slowly turned around and checked the living room. Gary's body, the whiskey bottle on the table, the closed hatch next to the wardrobe, but there was no human figure anywhere. The yard beyond the broken window just swayed indifferently in the desert wind. Victor hesitated a beat, then shouted shortly at the empty air of the dim living room. I'll help you. Where are you? Two feelings were loaded simultaneously in that shout. One was that he truly didn't want to leave her behind, and the other was the desire to confirm if that nonsense word dying Gary spilled at the end was really what he heard. His voice briefly struck the walls of the narrow living room and faded. 1 beat, 2 beats, no answer returned, and no shadow moved. Victor gave a short shake of his head and opened the front door. Concluding that he must have misheard, he walked out under the late afternoon sun of the desert. As he got into Gary's pickup truck and started the engine, one side of the cabin's broken window rattled loosely in the desert wind behind his back. The cabin soon shrunk in his rearview mirror, and he never looked back at it again. Arriving in the city, Victor hid in his own lines for a few days to recover his wounds while cleaning up the aftermath of the 3 ambushers and his own tracks. During those few days, he also finished leaking a false report to his colleagues about Gary's death, a storyline that Gary was hit along with Victor by the ambush team, and since conditions didn't allow for recovering the body in the middle of the desert, it would be handled with the family as a logging site accident. It was a flawless report. Only one thing bothered him, a lingering stare on his shoulder. The source of that gaze was Raoul, a single replacement part slotted into Gary's empty spot. Raoul, one of Gary's former subordinates, had early on accepted the fact that, to whoever was looking down from above, Victor, Gary, and himself were all just identically shaped parts moving along a conveyor belt. Showing no interest in the fact that his superior died a few days ago, he continued his endless chatter without a shred of truth, ranging from who was sleeping with whom to gambling debts in certain cities, even after taking that spot.
Victor, is it true that you brought a young girl to Dr. Mama and barely survived? Are you dating that girl? I heard someone saw you together.
Victor smirked and shortly replied, "No." But the motor attached to Raoul's mouth didn't stop. Neither he nor the other colleagues believed Raoul's words, so it wasn't something to worry about. But how did a guy like that end up as Gary's successor? Victor let out a faint sigh and reorganized the tasks he had to do today in his head once more. The pain in his side had become bearable over the past few days, and today was the day he had to meet Gary's family. In the late afternoon, he got into his car and headed to a quiet residential area on the outskirts of the city. White fences, well-kept lawns, a lilac tree in the garden. In front of that house, so ordinary it was terrifying, he temporarily turned off the engine and caught his breath. He slowly got out of the car, walked up the gravel path of the garden, and knocked on the front door. Opening the door was Gary's wife, Martha, an ordinary, middle-aged woman he had once exchanged greetings with at a supermarket checkout. The moment she saw Victor's face, she covered her mouth with one hand, as if intuiting something.
Victor, what's wrong?
Taking off his hat, Victor bowed his head briefly.
Could we talk inside for a moment? It would be good if Sarah was here too.
On the living room sofa, Victor sat facing Martha and her daughter Sarah, who was holding her mother's hand tightly. It wasn't too long ago that Victor had last seen Sarah at a neighborhood barbecue last summer. But she had grown a lot since then. Dark hair close to brown, blue eyes, somehow resembling some other face. Withdrawing his gaze for a beat, Victor opened his mouth.
It's about Gary. A few days ago, there was an accident at a business trip location.
Martha's hand slowly stiffened over Sarah's.
It was at a logging site north of Nevada. A safety incident occurred there, and Gary was at the site. The accident was large-scale, and the site was hard to access, so several bodies were buried at once. The company attempted to recover the bodies, but in the end, they couldn't bring him back in a form presentable to the family.
Martha's shoulders slowly began to collapse, while Sarah bit her lip tightly and placed a hand on her mother's shoulder to support her, though that hand was trembling minutely too. Resting his gaze briefly on the carpet pattern, Victor continued his words.
Gary was a good friend, a friend who saved my life many times. Not being able to guess his feelings at the end is what I am most sorry about.
He ended his words there, neither too long nor too short. Martha sobbed for a long time, and Sarah bit her lip beside her, holding her mother's shoulder. Judging it inappropriate to offer further words of comfort, Victor stood up from his seat after a while. Unable to stand, Martha stayed put, while Sarah saw Victor to the front door instead.
Uncle Victor, did my dad really pass away like that?
She asked in front of the door. The 17-year-old's blue eyes, having grown noticeably, looked straight up at Victor.
He did, Victor replied shortly. I'm sorry.
Sarah bit her lip once more and briefly bowed her head. Victor lightly patted her shoulder once and stepped out into the garden. The front door slowly closed behind his back as he walked down the gravel path to his car. Through the branches of the lilac tree in the garden, the late afternoon sun slanted down, and the mundane noise of a neighbor's lawnmower drifted from afar. It was so peaceful that, for a moment, he could almost believe the events in the desert had been a dream. The moment he placed his hand on his car door handle, "Help me." Victor's hand stopped dead. The voice he heard at the desert safe house, one of the 3 phrases of a young child locked in a basement for days. Victor slowly looked around. There was no one in the garden. All the windows of Sarah's house were closed, and not a single car drove past on the street. Only the lilac branches swayed once in the wind. Yet somehow, unable to leave the spot immediately, he shouted into the air, "I'll help you! Where are you?" His voice cut through the late afternoon silence and briefly spread out. 1 beat, 2 beats. A lilac branch minutely swayed once more, but no answer returned. Victor stood there for a long time, and finally shook his head shortly and opened the car door. He thought he should at least visit a hospital. It had been a tough day, but he never expected the incident to affect him for this long. Victor started the engine and slowly pulled out of the street in front of Sarah's house. Right after he turned the corner and disappeared from sight, the doorbell rang briefly at Sarah's front door. Sarah, who had been sobbing while holding her mother on the sofa, slowly raised her head as Martha pressed her eyes with the back of her hand and patted Sarah's shoulder. "Who is it? Please go check, Sarah." Sarah hugged her mother's shoulder one more time and got up. From beyond the door, Victor's voice was heard. "I have one more thing to tell you. Please open the door." Sarah unlatched the door chain and slowly opened the door. Beyond the threshold stood someone else, not Victor. Messy brown hair, a faint bruise spreading over a pale cheek, and 2 blood-red eyes with all the capillaries in the whites burst. Something that had been buried under desert dirt for days, with dry soil dangling here and there from her clothes, stared straight at Sarah in the late afternoon silence. Sarah's 2 legs froze in place for a moment, but it was truly just a moment. A padlock she had been holding shut over her friend's missing person report for days snapped open all at once. "Chloe?" "Hi, Sarah." Sarah didn't even know how her hands moved. She was already grabbing Chloe's hand and pulling her inside. All the words she hadn't even been able to bring up to her mother over the past few days poured out of her mouth at once. "Oh my God, Chloe. You're alive. You're really alive, right? Do you know your mom is about to go crazy? Everyone reported it. Where were you? Wait, are you hurt? Is this a bruise? Which bastard? I'll call 911. No, your mom first. No, why are you so cold? Wait, Chloe, did you hear? My dad. They say my dad passed away, just now, at a logging site. They couldn't even find his body. You're alive, but my dad... Then why are you... Just sit. I'll get water. No, wait." Sarah was losing herself amidst the endless flow of relief, sorrow, and terror pouring from her mouth. Without even listening to all those words, Chloe was just gently holding Sarah's hands back. "It's okay, Sarah." The corners of Chloe's mouth lifted faintly. It wasn't the familiar smile a 17-year-old friend gives to another friend. It was a smile from something that had spent days beneath shallow desert soil, finally facing a familiar face once again. "I'll tell you everything." The wide-open front door began to slowly move inward, though no one pushed it. A lilac branch swayed once more in the garden. The sunlight was still slanting, the street still peaceful, with no screams heard anywhere, and no hands reaching for help visible anywhere. Just the front door of an ordinary American suburban house, slowly, very slowly, closing, completely unaware of what had entered it. The door chain hooked back into place from the inside. What Martha feared the most was Sarah. The child changed from the day she learned of Gary's death. For the first few days, she thought Sarah was just drenched in sorrow. What 17-year-old could be fine after hearing of her father's passing? During those few days, Martha frequently passed by Sarah's door, quietly listening to the muffled sound of faint sobbing inside. And she too would collapse onto the living room sofa, drowning in her own grief. However, after the first week passed and the second week began, Sarah's sorrow was transforming into something else. The first thing Martha noticed was the swearing. One night, while doing the dishes in the kitchen, Sarah, sitting on the living room sofa, in the middle of that silence without even the TV on, suddenly began spitting curses in a low but clear voice. Disgusting bastard. Real, dirty bastard. Deserves to die. Glad he's dead. I should have killed him myself. Martha almost dropped a plate and stopped her hands. Sarah? From the living room, Sarah slowly turned her head. A brief silence fell in those blue eyes, as if looking at someone other than her mother, and soon Sarah's expression slowly collapsed. Mom, I'm sorry. What did I say? What was I talking about? I'm sorry, Mom, sorry. I shouldn't say that to Dad. I shouldn't do that to a dead person. I must be crazy, Mom. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands and started sobbing uncontrollably. Martha threw down the dish towel and ran to hug her daughter. Yes, the grief is consuming her, she explained to herself. Our Sarah is having too hard a time. But after that night, Sarah's cursing continued more often and for longer periods. Some days while peeling apples in the kitchen, some days while combing her hair in front of the bathroom mirror, some days touching the lilac branches in the garden. Disgusting bastard, ugly bastard, hitting on people with that belly and that hair, snoring next to her every night. When Martha heard that last line, she had to grip the corner of the dining table and stand frozen in place for a long time. It was an expression Sarah had never let slip from her mouth. Then, a beat late, Sarah would break down, covering her mouth. Mom, did I do it again? I'm sorry, Mom. I'm really sorry. Why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep… Martha just hugged her daughter. Hugged her again, and hugged her yet again. When Sarah came back from school one afternoon, wearing her skirt shortened by a hand's breadth, another thin crack was drawn in a corner of Martha's heart. That short skirt was an outfit Martha didn't recognize. It certainly wasn't in Sarah's closet. When asked where she got it, Sarah simply replied, I borrowed it from a friend, and went into her room. When Martha asked what friend, Sarah paused, stared off into the distance, and slowly let out one word. Chloe. Martha's breathing momentarily stopped. Chloe, Sarah's best friend whose missing person report had been filed a few days ago. That young brown-haired girl whom everyone concluded was a runaway. Martha bit her lip once and cautiously asked toward Sarah's back. Chloe gave you that outfit, Sarah? Yes. When? Where is Chloe right now? I don't know, Mom, Sarah replied slowly, after standing in front of her door with one hand on it for a long time. She just drops by sometimes. The door closed. Martha stood frozen in that spot for a long time, eventually returning to the living room and collapsing in a corner of the sofa. There was a remark that neighbor Melissa had casually let slip, claiming she heard it at the local salon. A rumor that Sarah was known as a promiscuous girl among boys her age in the neighborhood lately. With not just one, but several boys, the moment Martha heard that line, she glared straight at Melissa once and left the place. However, in the car on her way home, she realized her hands holding the steering wheel were trembling. Knocking on Sarah's door that night, Martha began to interrogate her daughter without even gathering what words were coming out of her mouth. Who are you hanging out with these days? What have you been up to at school? Who exactly gave you those clothes? Who taught you that makeup? Did Chloe really teach you that? If she taught you, where is she now? At first, Sarah just stood listening. Then, at a certain moment, Her blue eyes slowly lifted toward her mother. "Lady, do you even know shit?" With the exact same tone she used while spitting low curses touching the lilacs in the living room a few days ago, Sarah confronted her mother. "You didn't even know what he was doing out there. How would you know what your daughter's been up to?" Martha's breath stopped dead on the spot. "Sarah?" Sarah paused for a beat, then soon covered her mouth with both hands and hugged her mother in a fit of sobs. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Why do I keep being like this? Mom, I'm scared. I'm really scared." Martha hugged her daughter, but that night she could not sleep. After sitting on the living room sofa for a long time, Martha finally got up and walked down the dark hallway to the front of Sarah's door. A regular breathing sound leaked through the crack of the slightly opened door, the peaceful, sleeping breath of a 17-year-old daughter. Standing on that threshold, Martha covered her mouth with one hand, and for a long time like that, unable to shed tears or make a sound, she just swallowed whatever was rising from deep inside her. Sarah shouldn't wake up. She tiptoed back down the hallway to the kitchen, took out a half-empty whiskey bottle from the cupboard, and poured it into a glass. When the glass was half full, she downed it in one gulp, praying to herself that the bitter taste of alcohol going down her esophagus would firmly seal up a certain dam deep inside her once more. It was then. "Help me." A thin word, drifting from somewhere. Martha's hand froze in place. She slowly raised her head to the dark kitchen, the garden outside the window. The lilac branches swayed once in the night wind, but besides that, nothing moved. But right in the middle of Martha's chest, that dam she had just plugged with alcohol collapsed all at once. The cold sensation she had buried in her deepest part surged upwards. Unknowingly leaning on the kitchen counter, she found herself running towards Sarah's room with trembling steps. She opened the door roughly. On the bed, Sarah was sleeping peacefully. The thin light from the hallway lamp flowing into the dark room shone diagonally on Sarah's profile. Dark, almost brown hair, unruffled. A small, regular breathing sound flowing out through slightly parted lips. It was ordinary, peaceful, exactly the sleeping figure of her 17-year-old daughter. Nothing more. Martha stood at the threshold for a long time, watching her daughter's breathing, then slowly closed the door and returned to the kitchen down the dark hallway. She poured alcohol into the glass again. While the glass filled halfway, passed halfway, and filled to the brim, she didn't withdraw the mouth of the liquor bottle. The glass overflowed, and cold liquid spilled onto the dining table and over the back of her hand. She didn't notice it. And so, the night went on.
The hills have more to tell. Subscribe, and we'll find you when the next story is ready.